So I'm going to now introduce Tracey Thompson, who'll tell us how librarians are responding to these threats and defending our freedom to read. Tracey is vice chair of the Washington Library Association's Intellectual Freedom Section. She's a senior leader for the King County Library System. She has over 17 years of experience working in libraries. Her job at KCLS is as Director of Collection Development Services, which means she's in charge of selecting books and other materials for the library. Tracey calls herself an ardent supporter of intellectual freedom and supporter of people's First Amendment right to access library materials and information that meets their needs. As with many other librarians, she's a lifelong reader, and she says she has the groaning bookshelves to prove it. She lives with her partner in the Puget Sound area, along with what she says are 3 feisty dogs, who she says are in an endless battle with the neighboring squirrels, and with 1 cat who plans on conquering the world just as soon as he finishes his nap. Over to you, Tracey.
Thank you. I'll just stick it in my pocket. Well, thank you very much for inviting me out here. I'm here on the behalf of the Washington Library Association, and we're really excited to see people here really interested in intellectual freedom. My expertise is in public libraries. As Ronnie did a great introduction for me, my pronouns are she, her. And I have worked in military, academic, and public libraries. I can answer maybe a few questions about school libraries, but my real expertise lays in the public library arena. So I won't go back through the introduction, but I'm paying the pet tax. So those are 2 of my dogs, Rhea and Lexi, who Lexi likes, as you can see, to sleep and be covered, and Rhea just wants attention. So talking about intellectual freedom and why is it important? It is a First Amendment right. Libraries are guided by and bound by legalities. Is considered an infringement upon the First Amendment for us to discriminate against a book based on a viewpoint. So if a book doesn't agree with our values, or if we find offensive, for us to remove that book, it would be a violation of the First Amendment. Talking about the impact of this, though, imagine a book that was meaningful to you. Maybe as you were growing up, you saw yourself represented in the community. Maybe it helped guide you to your career. Now imagine that someone has said this book is not appropriate, and they're going to remove it from the libraries. They're even trying to remove some of them from being sold. How would that impact you? How would that would that have changed the trajectory of your life, or just maybe the quality of your life, not to be able to access those books anymore? We talk about the First Amendment protects against, again, that freedom of speech. It is one of our foundations. If we don't have that freedom of speech, we aren't able to have that discourse. We're not able to have that democracy, not able to have those discussions. Libraries are declared by courts as a limited public forum, and this is specifically public libraries, meaning that people have the right to come to the libraries and be able to receive information. Again, without discrimination about what that information is, without judgment. When you come into the library, we're not going to judge why you asked for that book. We don't know. It's not really necessary unless we're trying to really peg down what it is you're looking for, where we may ask questions for that. You also have the right to privacy when you're enacting that. Unless you have chosen for your reading history to be tracked, because some people do like to go back and see that, we do not track your reading history. We don't track who accessed a database. who accesses our resources. If you just come in and look at books, we don't track that. You have that right to privacy, which again is really critical, especially if you're trying to find information on controversial topics that may be outside of your cultural norms. Having that right to privacy is just a really critical piece. What's really important also to understand is what libraries defend is not that specific title. We're defending your right to be able to access that title, to read, listen, or view. A lot of times when we talk about intellectual freedom, we're speaking about books, or people talk about books, but really intellectual freedom encompasses audiobooks, encompasses digital content, includes movies as well. Along with your freedom to be able to read, view, or listen, you also have the right not to check that item out. We're not forcing you to check out an item that doesn't fit your values. However, what you don't have the right is to decide what someone else can check out. That's where your right stops. Kind of important to remember. Some of the factors for what goes into a library collection, we'll talk about each of these, is scope and demand, representation, socioeconomic conditions, controversial viewpoints, and welcoming spaces. So starting with scope and demand, what we look for is kind of what we call the width and the breadth of our collection. What are the community interests, and how can we cover those topics? We are limited by budget, even though at King County we have a very, by many libraries compared to generous budget, we still have a budget limitation. We also have shelving limitations. We are not able to collect everything that is ever published. I actually had a patron very upset with me one time that we were buying DVDs, thought instead of buying DVDs that we should buy every book that was ever published. I was like, not even Library of Congress can accomplish that feat. So we do have some limitations. We try to be good stewardships of our dollars, something I hear our selectors speak about quite frequently. We're also looking at balancing that scope with stewardship. For example, there are some items that we don't have in our collection because they're just not appropriate for a library. Maybe it's a workbook that's designed for people to write in, that's really designed for a one-time use. It may have a plastic comb binding that just won't stand up to library use. We don't collect picture books that are, so the books for the very young children that are paperback, because they just don't last. And they get lost in the collection because they're so thin. But our criteria is really designed for us to be able to say yes to adding things into our collection. But no library can collect everything. So we really look at the data. We talk to our community and ask them about what their needs are. We also have interlibrary loan. Almost every public library offers this, where you can ask for us to get books from other library systems. We've gotten books from the Library of Congress, from NASA, which I always think is really cool. I have to go pet the books when they come in, especially NASA. I just think that's amazing. We also have where you can request for us to purchase a book that we don't already own. And a lot of times we will purchase those items. At King County Library System, we get about 4,000 to 5,000 of those requests a month. So it's very heavily used. It's a lot. Our circulation, a little bit about just King County real briefly. We have 53 locations. 49 of those are actual libraries. We have 2 remote locations where like locker pickups. We also have a warehouse and a service center. So, we spread across a really wide area. We are separate from the Seattle public system. It is 2 separate library systems. King County is an independent library district, meaning we don't have a city or county that we depend upon. We have our own sources of revenue, and we have our own board of trustees. Whereas Seattle Public is part of the city system and have the city governance as part of their system there. Representation and socioeconomic conditions. There was a librarian, Rudine Sims Bishop, who in the 90s coined a phrase, windows, doors, and mirrors. So we really try to bring this into our library collection, meaning that we want to provide a mirror. People should see themselves represented in the collection. no matter your race, your religion, your sexual identity. You should also be able to see a window so you can see into other cultures. Seeing and reading about other cultures helps to develop empathy. And with that empathy, you step through the door and can experience in those other cultures. So that's where representation comes in. We really strive to remove socioeconomic barriers. Information costs money, unfortunately. So libraries try to remove that barrier and provide that information. And that information can come in many forms. It could be your physical book, could be an ebook, audiobooks, could be digital resources such as databases. A lot of those have paid walls. Databases can cost six figures. So we really try to remove that barrier and be able to provide those resources to our communities. It could also be connecting them to services that they need, whether it's a social service, a government service. There's all kinds of different ways for people to access information. Controversial viewpoints and welcoming spaces. This may seem kind of like a dichotomy. Like these two things may not go together. But it's really, again, to be able to provide a safe place for people to access controversial information. We protect your privacy, we protect your safety within the library. Information needs, they're personal, they're very individual. We do collect for the community, but your needs can be very individual, and we try to meet everybody's needs. A lot of what we hear, sorry, I'm trying not to walk around too much. A lot of what we hear about book bans is talking about materials that are inappropriate for children. So I wanted to touch a little bit on about placement in the collection. Our collection, and in many large libraries, we have a collection development department or a group of librarians whose job it is solely to select books for the library. These librarians are literally experts in their field. Our children's librarians are expert in early learning literacy. They do a lot of work in this area. They've been doing this work for many years. And so what they look at when they're deciding where it's appropriate to put a book is what was the creator's intention? Who's the target audience for this? What do the experts recommend for reviews? We look at professional journals, Kirkus reviews, book lists. There's a lot of different review sources that we use. We look at where the publisher wanted to put the book. We look at the developmental needs of the audience. Is it appropriate? Can they understand the book? Does it meet their needs? And we also look at, if we put this book somewhere, does it create a barrier to access, which is also an infringement upon the First Amendment. So if we put a children's book in the adult collection, that's creating a barrier to the access to the child, which would be considered, again, that infringement upon their First Amendment, because even children have First Amendment rights. So labeling, we try to label books for discovery. So you may see like genre labels on there intended to increase discovery. But if a label is intended to increase that barrier, such as the Texas law that was passed that wanted to label the level of sexual content in the book, which was designed to create a barrier to access that book. Right now, there's an injunction against the law because it's considered a violation of the First Amendment. Inclusive versus exclusive. One thing to keep in mind that's really important is the courts, not the libraries, not the communities, decide if a book is obscene. And there's a test we'll talk about here coming up here. Offering information, again, it doesn't block access to that information. Not offering that information blocks somebody's access to it. Libraries promote the parents or caregivers' right to guide their children's access. The caregiver can decide what is right and appropriate for that child. They cannot decide what is right for another family. And when you look at children, for example, if you have two 13-year-old children, they have very differing needs. So one book that might be very appropriate for this child based on his lived experiences, where he is at mentally in his development, may be very inappropriate for a different 13-year-old, again, based on their experiences and where they're at in their development. So it is really up to the caregivers. Public libraries do not act as imperantus locus. We don't act in place of the parent. Where that right stops is, again, deciding what is appropriate for another child. This is what I alluded to earlier, is the Miller's test. This is it was based on a California court case, and it's a 3-point test. And all 3 of these elements must be passed for the book to be declared obscene by the courts. Number 1 is whether the average person applying contemporary community standards, so it is based on that community. There has been kind of an effort to try to make this a national standard, but it has not been successful, because what is considered appropriate in California may not be considered appropriate in Florida. So it is based on those local community standards. And it's taken the work as a whole. Often, a lot of the challenges that we're seeing lately, they come up with this very specific passage, or in a case of a graphic novel, a certain picture, without looking at the book in the entirety. And looking at the merit and the value of the book as a whole. And again, whether the book describes or depicts in a patently offensive way sexual content specifically defined by the applicable state law, and whether the work, again, taken as a whole, lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. I am not actually aware of any books that have met these 3 criteria. I'm sure there exists one somewhere. If it does meet the Miller's test and the courts have declared it as obscene, libraries would not be able to carry it because it would be an illegal item. We are seeing, as the video stated, major changes and challenges. It used to be that parent or caregiver that read a book would bring it in because they were startled when they checked out and were concerned about the appropriateness of the material. My first challenge that I dealt with was in my very first library in a military Air Force base in Germany. I had a mother that brought up she brought up actually 2 challenges. One, she was concerned she was reading a picture book to her child about a prince that went off to find the princess, the perfect princess. Well, come to turn out what he was interested in really was the prince. And so she was really concerned about that. And then also the Harry Potter books. This was when the Harry Potter books first came out, and it was in the midst of them being released, and she was concerned about witchcraft with the books. And so we had a very interesting conversation about the First Amendment, and that her husband, who was active duty military, had sworn to uphold the First Amendment. And that meant providing access to all materials and free speech. So she was a little kind of startled by that. And I do have to give J.K. Rowling credit. We were discussing at dinner earlier about, 20 years ago, children's literature was really much more controlled than it is today in some ways. It used to be books really had to have that literary value, that literary kind of that literary realism. You wouldn't have found a lot of fantasy books. You wouldn't have found a lot of sci-fi or genre books. And so J.K. Rowling did really open that up. And we saw a lot more type of books being published for juvenile fiction and teen books. And the same with the Twilight series. It really kind of opened up some of the teen books, and it got a lot of interest, got a lot of children or teen girls especially reading. So despite their politics, kudos to them. Talking about, again, the challenges, changes. So we've gone from, these few where you can answer with a polite letter and, that would address the issue, to we have groups, national groups, that are really training local chapters on how to make challenges. So they train them how to disrupt board meetings. They give them a list of books to challenge, which could be hundreds of books, which could overwhelm a library system, especially small systems, maybe only have a few librarians available. Even a large library system, we would get overwhelmed if we have a list of hundreds of books that were challenged at once. And they're not even most of the times reading the books. A lot of the times when I've had people who challenge a book, I ask, one of the questions we ask is, did you read the book? Quite often the answer is no. They've been told that this book is inappropriate. We actually here in Washington had someone print off the top 10 most banned books in the U.S. The American Library Association puts that out every year. They brought that book in or that list in. And it was obviously, they just printed the web page off and said, please ban these books and remove them from the library. And I thought, boy, did you miss the purpose of that website. And we've had communities here in Washington. We were almost the first state to disband a library or close a library based on intellectual freedom because the library wouldn't remove some books that they requested. And that was started by one person. So it is a few voices that are speaking very loudly that are asking these books to be removed. Most of the surveys that are being conducted, either by PEN America, who was mentioned, American Library Association, show that the majority of people disagree with banning books. Yet we're seeing politicians run on it as a platform. There's a politician, she's 24 years old, in Missouri, who's running for Secretary of State. The Secretary of State, very young, Secretary of State often controls the libraries in the state, is in charge of the state libraries. She's running on the platform of burning books. In her campaign ads, it actually shows her burning books. It's a little frightening that she thinks this is a successful platform. And we do have politicians successfully running on platforms banning books. We had recently, Florida sent home, there was a Florida school that sent home permission slips for the children to be able to hear a book by a Black author. So they had to get permission from the parents to read this book in the classroom. There is hope though. There are several states that have passed, and I had to write this down. There are, Virginia, Washington, New Jersey, Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and Massachusetts, and Oregon are passing laws that are pro-intellectual freedom. And they vary kind of across the board. Some are banning book bans. Say that 5 times fast. Washington is trying to pass a law currently that makes it more difficult in the state of Washington to disband a library or to close a library. They actually have 2 bills, and that is for the public libraries. They have one for school libraries to ban book banning, or essentially stating that you cannot discriminate a book based on viewpoint. I was like, gosh, that sounds awfully familiar. Maybe a little bit like the First Amendment. And that's what a lot of these state laws are passing. There's not always this realization by people that the state laws that are being passed violate both the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment. But so far, most of them we're seeing a lot of injunctions, the courts coming through. Even the 5th District Court in Texas, which is considered one of the most conservative courts in the U.S., has put injunctions against laws banning books. So, there is some hope out there, and we will see where that goes. Banning behavior. We often talk about challenges and book bans, but it may also be kind of what we call passive behavior. We've had library displays where someone checks out the entire display with the intention that no one else can check out the books then. We've had books defaced. We've had people go in. There was one book that was returned where every swear word was kind of colored over with a Sharpie or something. We've had books that people will put religious pamphlets in. They'll hide books in the library. And again, check out books with the intention of never returning them because they disagree with their value. We've had books stolen. Books on witchcraft are actually kind of hard to keep on the shelf. Surprisingly, they get stolen quite often. The Bible is also stolen quite often, for whatever reason. So it really has changed. And, the video talked about, the threat to librarians. There are several laws that have been passed. Missouri is one. I think it's either North Dakota or South Dakota. I believe it was North Dakota. There's about 4 or 5 states, I think, that have passed laws that criminalize librarians having books that either are considered harmful to minors. So how do you define what is harmful to minor? Who defines what's harmful to minor? Or is pornographic, depending on the state, how they kind of word the law. And again, if you look at it, and some of them right now have injunctions because of the vagueness of them. Because who decides, again, what is harmful to minor? If you have someone from the far right, they may say a book about LGBTQ is harmful to minor. Well, if we start removing those books based on that, someone from the left can say that this book on, I've actually, one of the few challenges I've had made to my desk while I've been at King County Library System was for the Bible, for pornography and violence. So someone from the left can say, this is harmful to me, remove this book. And then you've really kind of opened the door, and almost every book has someone who finds it harmful. So we really do have to be careful about that. And again, it's an infringement upon the First Amendment. Book bans are on a rise. The video kind of alluded to this or talked about this a little bit. And the graphic's a little bit hard to see. This was in 2020. You can see in 2021. And in 2022, it's over 2,500. In 2023, we met that and passed it before half of the year was even over. And this is by the types of libraries receiving book bans. Often we hear about school libraries. 41% of the book bans are school libraries. But for the public libraries, it's now 48%. And this is in 2022 numbers. So I'm not sure what the numbers for 2023 have not been released yet. So I'm not sure if that is holding true or not. But we're getting just as many in the public libraries as they are facing in the school libraries. And most of them initiating the challenge. It used to be almost parents or patrons, but again, we're seeing 17% in 2022 from both political and religious groups. Now we have stated in our policy or our procedure for King County Library System, we did recently update our policies. And our procedure states that for someone to request for us to evaluate a book, they have to live within our service county, our service area. We also limit the number of challenges that they can place at one time, so 3 a year, and the number of times that we will evaluate a title, so once every 3 years, just to kind of make this manageable for us. Ways that you can support intellectual freedom. Use your library. It's probably one of the number one ways. Public libraries are just such a great resource. I may be a little bit biased, but be informed. This is a great start, learning about intellectual freedom, talking about these issues. It's difficult to keep up with the laws. Just in this year, so in the first 2 months of this year, over 100 laws about censorship have been introduced, about intellectual freedom, I should say, because some of them have been positive. Speak at your board meetings, whether it's your board of trustees for public libraries, your school boards, especially when there's issues around censorship. Contact your media outlets. Op-ed pieces can be very powerful. Speak with your legislators about your thoughts and feelings about intellectual freedom. Let them know it's an important issue to you. And also sign the Freedom to Read Statement. It is the 70th anniversary of the Freedom to Read Statement. I have been very fortunate to be on the American Library Association task force to evaluate the Freedom to Read Statement to see if our membership have felt it needed to be updated, because it is 70 years old. It was written in 1953 in response to McCarthyism. Unfortunately, it reads like it was written today. So it's very applicable, and we'll see where the association goes with this. It is a statement that is written jointly with many of the publishing associations. So it's not written alone by the American Library Association, and so we would definitely have to stakeholder any changes with them as well. But it's a very powerful statement. It's one of the foundational documents of the library. And because of the 70th anniversary, they're celebrating it and asking people to sign it, and kind of reaffirming the intellectual freedom values. Some resources I've listed here. The American Library Association has just a lot of information on their website about intellectual freedom and banned books. Every library has a bill tracking to kind of try to keep track of the bills that are being introduced. PEN America, as mentioned in the video, is a really great resource, and also United Against Banned Books. And this is an organization started by the American Library Association to help fight censorship. And there was a resource I just found out about today that came across my desk before I came here. And it's a book review where you can go on and look up a book, and it gives you a book synopsis. It gives you the reviews of the book, any praise. It talks about awards, accolades, media resources, and successful defenses in response to challenges, and note on age ranges. So this is a source we'll definitely be looking at in our library. This one is particular for All Boys Aren't Blue, which is a memoir manifesto. That is one of the top 13 of the banned book list for 2022. There were several books that were tied, so instead of having the top 10, we have the top 13 for 2022. And any questions?
Thank you very much, Tracey. And I'm sure you all do have many questions. Our practice here at Horizon House is to ask you to raise your hands, and we have mic runners to bring to you microphones so you can ask your question so everyone can hear it. And Tracey, I'll ask you, if you would, to repeat the question so everybody knows what it is before you answer. Thank you. Anybody have any questions?
I think I may have missed it. What is the standing of Miller's test?
The Miller's test is based on a court case that was in California about 20 or 30 years ago, I think. I might be getting the date of it wrong. And it's the test that the courts use to determine whether or not an item is considered obscene. And only the courts are able to declare an item obscene or pornographic.
I mean, what is its legal standing? Who pays attention to it?
All the states must follow it as a court precedence. Is that answering your question?
What if a county said we're not interested in it?
I'm sorry, I forgot to repeat the question. The question was, what is the status or the standing of the Miller test? And if a county wants to ignore the Miller's test and just declare items are obscene or pornographic, which is what we're seeing. We're seeing states pass laws to declare items obscene or pornographic, especially in Florida. We're seeing those books removed. It'll be for the courts to decide. So it's going to be several years, really, before we've seen the results of this. And eventually, I think some of these may go to the Supreme Court.
I'm thinking that this Miller test may refer to Henry Miller, the author of Tropic of Cancer. And Tropic of Cancer was declared to be obscene in some states. And so it was challenged, and I think it was the Supreme Court that determined that in order for a book to be declared obscene, it had to meet various tests, one of which is the book as a whole, whatever the three points were, the book taken as a whole has appeals to the prurient interest and things like that. But Miller test refers to that decision by the Supreme Court. So because it was the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, it applies to every state and every jurisdiction in the United States. Question back there?
Oh, that was extremely interesting. Thank you so much. I don't understand why a person can walk into a library and say, remove these books, when you have these guidelines in place. What right do they have to walk in there and say, get rid of these books? I don't get it.
And it was a statement saying that she doesn't get why people feel that they have the right to come in and say these books aren't appropriate to remove them. The point is they don't. You know, why they think they do. And the point to make is a lot of times when people are asking the books to be removed, there's mixed motives. Some people generally feel that these books are harmful and want them removed based on their beliefs and think that their beliefs are kind of not necessarily trump everyone else's, but part of their beliefs are their evangelism and that they must remove these books. Some, it's for political reasons. Again, you know, politicians are running on this as a platform. You said they haven't even read the books. Quite often they have not read the books. Yeah. When you are able to understand it, please come explain it to me.
I think it was Grant County that tried to close down or maybe it was Dayton. I don't know.
It was in Dayton,
It
yes.
was Dayton. They tried to close the library. But as a regional or a county-wide library, you cover quite a wide area. And we're in a bit of a bubble here in Seattle. So what's your sense of what is bubbling up, you know, outside of the I-5 corridor of protests against books or situations that could evolve to something like Dayton?
And the question was, you know, outside of kind of the Seattle bubble or the I-5 corridor, what's my sense of what is kind of bubbling up there regarding intellectual freedom? We are seeing a lot of passive banning. We're seeing challenges. I know in Renton, there is actually a brewery that is doing a drag queen story time. I'm sorry, and they faced bomb threats, and that is here in Renton, not very far outside of Seattle. Kent school libraries have faced censorship where one of the administrators tried to remove several books from their libraries. And our chair for the Intellectual Freedom Committee, Gavin Downing, was a library at the time and fought it and was mostly successful getting those books to retain in the library. I think it's bubbling up. I think we're going to see more challenges come across. We haven't faced a formal challenge in King County in the last couple of years, but I think it's a matter of when, not if. So that's where we launched in October. I didn't talk about this in the presentation, but in October we launched a Celebrate Freedom to Read. And what we're doing is we're trying to reframe the conversation about intellectual freedom. So instead of focusing on we don't ban books and we have something in our library to offend everyone, which libraries have been very proud of that for many years, and it's, you know, it's not wrong. We're trying to refocus that conversation about we are really working to protect your First Amendment rights. We have, you know, this book may not be right for you, and that is okay. But we can help you find something that is right for you. Give us that opportunity. You know, we're happy to have that conversation. We're happy to explain why this material might be in the library. We'd love having those conversations. And let us help you find materials that meet your needs. So that's where we're trying to go out and build positive community support. We're trying to find allies. We're trying to talk to people about what they can do to support intellectual freedom before we see a lot of that come to our state. Because I really think it's a matter of when, not if. And I think the next elections, the 2024 elections, I don't know where they're going to go. They could be very telling. So that's kind of my worry.
So speaking of support, do you feel that you have support in our legislature, Washington State Legislature?
The question was, do I feel we have support in the Washington State Legislature? I do. Currently, our Secretary of State is one who's been kind of the driving force between these two laws to help protect libraries against censorship. I think the laws have a decent chance of passing, so we will see. We also have, we are extremely fortunate in King County that we have a very supportive Board of Trustees. They are absolutely thrilled to be able to support intellectual freedom, and they've really been our champions.
Is there such a thing as a library historian who knows about how this whole subject was treated through the ages back when the Alexandria Library existed?
It's so funny you mentioned that. And the question was, is there a historian that's tracked the history of intellectual freedom through the ages? And he specifically called out Library of Alexandria. I've often used that as an example for censorship, that censorship dates back to Library of Alexandria, because the Pharaoh had some very defined ideas of what was appropriate for the library and what wasn't. I don't know of a specific historian. I know the American Library Association has a history through the U.S. There are, I'm sure, some professors in the information schools or library schools that have tracked that. I've done some casual research myself, but I would not consider myself an expert by any means. But that would be really interesting to do.
Tracey, back here.
Yes.
Is this on?
Yes.
We're talking a lot about people trying to get certain books removed and books banned.
Mm-hmm.
But is there a similar movement to get certain DVDs, that is, movies, banned from libraries?
Strangely, and the question was, we've talked a lot about books, but is there, for censorship and banning, is there similar movement for DVDs? Strangely, there is not. The ratings on DVDs are by a volunteer organization, and they're done voluntarily. But I have not heard a lot of challenges across the U.S., specifically around DVDs. It's been specifically around books. There are, Oklahoma, I believe, has one on electronic resources. But I haven't heard a lot about electronic resources either. But they have targeted electronic resources, especially a vendor called Overdrive, which is the main vendor that public libraries use to provide ebooks and downloadable audio, that they're supposed to remove content that Oklahoma considers inappropriate. I don't see Overdrive ever doing that. They're very strong advocates for intellectual freedom.
It seems to me that one of the most important issues is the literary quality of the works, and I wonder how much reviews of books are brought into discussions when people want to ban something like The Catcher in the Rye. Do the librarians produce the reviews that were written long ago and try to demonstrate their literary value?
And the question was about the literary value of books being brought into question, and do libraries produce reviews to defend the literary quality of the book? And yes, we do. We have pulled out, when a book is challenged or when we receive a request for evaluation, oftentimes we'll pull out the professional reviews about the book. We'll pull out the awards that the book has won, if it's awarded any. We look and we'll also pull out how many other libraries have it. The information is often available through an organization called ruralcad.org, or OCLC, who runs it. But yeah, we absolutely do. Now, where the challenge comes in with this is there's been a surge in independent authors, because publishers don't really treat their writers very well, surprisingly enough. The average writer, this is not your James Patterson, but your average writer gets about maybe 8 to 12% of the royalties. If you independently publish, like through Amazon, which we won't talk about too much, but you could get 75% of the royalties. And with the advent of Amazon and Kindle Unlimited, we just have a surgence of independent authors. They have a challenge getting their books reviewed because there's no one advocating for them. You can go to Kirkus and pay to have your book reviewed, and I had recommended that to an author once because it is difficult to get your book in the smaller library systems without that professional review. Some require the book to be professionally reviewed. And her book didn't receive a very good review, so she was not very happy with me. Like, I'm sorry. But yeah, it's absolutely a resource that we do use.
So I'm wondering to what extent these people are historically not knowledgeable, because the main book that comes to mind in the 20th century is James Joyce's Ulysses. So I'm wondering if these people have a clue about anything historically banned, or if they're just dealing with the here and now.
That is a really good question, and unfortunately I can't answer it. Most of what we're seeing come across recently have been currently published titles, as opposed to your what could be called a classic or historic, more historic novels. What is currently on the top 13 banned are all currently published. Mouse being a great example, genderqueer, All Boys Aren't Blue. They're almost all LGBTQ or about race. But that is a really good question. If you look at the top 100 books that have been banned in history, there are a lot of those literary classics, award-winning, just really kind of books that have been foundational in literary courses through both high school and higher education. And the Bible is on the top 100. It's like number 50-something.
So if I'm the irate reader, client, customer, and I'm storming into the library and I say, get this book off your shelves, what's the process? I'm just curious what happens and how long will it take? And do I need a lawyer?
Well, hopefully you won't bring the lawyer in. But the first thing that happens is hopefully that library staff member is having a conversation. And I'm giving you the King County, the procedure at King County Library System. It varies from library to library. American Library Association does have recommended practices. Most of those we've incorporated into both we have a policy and then we also have a separate procedure. The policy is approved by our Board of Trustees. So this is our process. Hopefully when you come in, that librarian or that library staff member is having that conversation with you, talking about why we might carry a particular title and offering to find you something that does meet your needs. If you're still very insistent, it'll go up the kind of the management change a little bit to our regional managers and have that conversation. Again, have that conversation with you a little more in depth with a little more knowledge behind it. If you're very insistent, we have a material evaluation packet that you can fill out. To be able to fill that out, you have to live within our service area. You can only fill out for 3 titles at a time or within 1 calendar year, and they have to be on a separate packet. And we'll only consider a title once every 3 years. That packet then goes to, we have an intellectual freedom committee, and there's a subcommittee of that called Material Evaluation Committee. The standing members are our Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So we're very proud of the fact that we have an entire department dedicated to DEI. And myself are our designees. We will also pull in the appropriate selector. So if it's a children's book, we'll pull in the children's selector. If it's a teen book, adult book, so on. We'll also try to, because representation is very important to us, we'll also try to pull in members that belong to that community of the book that's being challenged. So if it's a book about racism, we may try to pull in members of the Intellectual Freedom Committee who represent that race. We do try to balance that with there's fatigue to ask someone to always represent their race. So we try to be very cognizant, and the DEI office helps us navigate that. And so the Intellectual Freedom Committee, or I'm sorry, the Material Evaluation Committee meets, and what we're looking for is, does that book meet our selection criteria and philosophy? And we have an 8-point selection criteria and philosophy. And again, that is designed for us to be able to say yes to a book. The only point of it that says no is number 8, and that's about the stewardship, where I talked about, is the format really appropriate? Is it a workbook? Is it comb-bound? Something like that. Or is it a very academic text that we may not, if we have one, we're not going to remove it, but we may not purchase it because our collection's designed more for the layperson. And then we look at, is the book appropriately classified? Meaning, is it appropriate for the teen audience or children's audience? And would it create a barrier moving into another one? If we say yes to both of those things, we keep the book. And we do not remove the book from the shelf during this process. It remains in circulation during this process. And then we respond back to the patron. Now, they have the right to be able to challenge that, and then it is heard by our executive director or their designee, and they make the final decision. It depends on, because we meet once a month, so it could take, if they hit like right as we met, it could take a whole month. Or if they, submit the challenge the week before we meet, it could be anywhere from a couple days to a month. No. And again, we've limited the number to help us be able to manage that.
You mentioned the Bible. What about the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita and the writings of Buddha?
I have not actually received any challenges asking us to remove them. Just
so
the Bible.
You do have them. You do have them in the library.
I believe so.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
a good. I haven't. I assume so. We've had it in other library systems I've worked at. I would have to look in our catalog quick to check.
In the fiction department?
There was a French mathematician that he developed it's considered one of the basic treatises in math, and presented it to Napoleon. And Napoleon asked, well, you never mentioned the creator in your whole treatise. And the mathematician replied, I had no need of that theory. Yes.
In your experience, has anyone tried to get the book Huckleberry Finn banned?
Yes.
I know this is my favorite childhood book, and I wanted to go down the Mississippi to New Orleans in my own little raft. But it's been challenged because it's derogatory to the slave Jim.
Yes, it has been a challenged book. I've not personally received a challenge for it, but I know it has been a challenge. And as the video mentioned, we get challenges from both sides of the political spectrum. A lot of the challenges that have made it to my desk have been from actually KCLS staff. And they've done it with the best of intentions, where they're concerned that a book is harmful to a community and want it removed. Again, for us to remove that book based on a viewpoint, it would be considered an infringement upon the First Amendment.
We're going to take one more question. Bill, go ahead.
Oh, is this the last question? Oh, good.
We have one more over here, too.
It better be a good one. This is not a question. I just wanted to say to you, and I hope you understand, that the vast majority of the public appreciates the kind of work civil servants of your sort do, and the time you take and the care you take and the procedures you make available to people who want books treated otherwise than the way we treat them. You're like election officials. We need people like you, and you get criticized a lot for political reasons, but I want you to know that we really do appreciate your work.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
And Bill, that was the perfect comment, because it's been suggested that those in this room who are librarians or have worked in libraries stand up and be acknowledged for all of the good that you do for our society. Come on. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Tracy.